Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm going to hand over to Sean, our CEO, to kick things off today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Sean Kinney, CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, and I just want to first welcome you and then say a couple of things. I've just literally got off the plane from COP coming back, and whilst stuff is happening, it's interesting. We need to be constantly reminded of the extraordinary extent of the challenge facing us, partly because we failed to listen to our scientists for the last 30 years, and now we're beginning to wake up around the world. So we need to drastically reduce emissions. We need to invest in a wholesale renovation of our industries. We need to build, of course, a lot more green energy, or clean energy going forward. In the industrial sector, which is a source of a very large chunk of global emissions, we need to transition because we need some of these things. We can't do it. We can do it without coal. We will do it without coal. It'll go. We will do it without gas. It'll go too, despite some of the controversies in the media now. And it questions how quickly we shut it down. But we're not going to be able to do without fertilizer. I do hope we're going to be able to cut fertilizer use by 50% because we overuse it. But overuse it doesn't mean not use it. And at the moment, fertilizer is made either from gas or dug out of the ground. The bulk of it actually from gas through the Fischer-Tropsch process. That's a problem. In steel, currently very carbon intensive. We need steel. We need to make sure it's green steel, which means produced by hydrogen or much more recycled electric arc furnaces and so on. And the shipping industry, we've got a real problem. The propulsion fuels for shipping, it's looking like the most effective thing is going to be some derivative of hydrogen or more likely ammonia. All of this means we really have to tackle the question of hydrogen. This is going to be a turnkey solution in industrial sectors. Whether it's energy or not, jury's still out. But certainly, we absolutely need it in hydrogen. Well, the world is moving on this. We have now plans worth trillions and trillions of dollars to develop hydrogen of different colors. You'll hear more about from our panelists about the colors, the green, pink, blue, black, gray. God forgive, don't go for black, whatever you do is disastrous, but you get the idea. We need to set proper standards about the kinds of hydrogen generation that we rely on going forward, about the kinds of environmental considerations to be addressed as we make this transition into a low carbon economy, which is a transition we have to make very, very quickly. We need to set standards which can be applied globally, not differentially in different sorts of markets, which is a bit the case of what's happening now. We have amongst African nations, just as an example, enormous plans, some of which are actually underway in Mauritania, Namibia, Egypt, as well as in Saudi and Chile. It's huge green hydrogen plans. This is hydrogen developed by renewable energy. We have the opportunity to make this work now because the cost of renewables, the cost of solar especially, has dropped so low and it's continuing to drop. On top of that, electrolyzer costs have dropped as well. So a mixture of opportunity, of demand because of the delegitimization of high carbon industries requires them to look at how they can still stay legitimate and useful to us as we shift to a low carbon world. And also some of the economic development opportunities for some countries that are being seen in these areas means we have to do it. But we do have to be conscious of those anxieties about making sure we're doing it properly. We're looking at criteria to support the growth of green bonds, green loans, and capital to finance this transition, to boost hydrogen in the right kind of way, to boost derivatives like ammonia, green ammonia, etc. That's what this panel's about. Thanks for joining us. And by the way, don't forget, keep on changing the world fast. We've only got 6 short years to reduce emissions by 50%. Hydrogen is part of the story, absolutely.
Thank you, Sean. We are going to have a brief introduction of the criteria in the world in a second and how they are exactly going to change the world. So that's the challenge. We'll be discussing a little bit more in a panel after we've had the presentation about what is the deal with hydrogen and how can it how can it change the world is the big lever we've all been looking for. But before we do that, one of the key parts is how do we define criteria, what for hydrogen, and what makes hydrogen low carbon. And so that's what my colleague Marianne Rodriguez will be taking us through, and then we'll be joined by our esteemed panelists who will be introduced in a minute on how and to discuss these topics. Before we go there, I'll give you a very brief introduction on what we do at Climate Bonds and all our different activities. So what you're looking at here is that light blue box, the standards and taxonomies. So the work we do on with academic institutions and experts, other NGOs all around the world to develop green bond standards and definitions. And I say even just green standards and definitions relating to hard to abate sectors, relating to greener and renewables, etc. So a whole range of sectors. We provide standards and criteria for what is green. But we do a whole lot of other things too. We do capacity building to take those definitions and criteria, workshops and training to educate people on what that looks like. We do engagement with investors on what the green bond market looks like and the green finance market looks like, including frameworks on transition and green finance and tools and knowledge to empower investors. We do a lot of research. We look at the market, we track the market, what's happening in the green finance market, particularly green bonds, and then we provide information and details and research on that work. We have market development work all around the world, in Latin America, in India, in the EU, in Asia Pacific, in China, where we work with local stakeholders to develop the market. And we also provide certification on green bonds and an increasing range of green finance instruments. And lastly, we also do work on policy. So linked to our market development work, we liaise with those local market stakeholders to integrate green finance policy into local markets. So that just gives you a very, very light touch on some of the activities that we're doing at Climate Bonds. But today we're really focusing on the core of that, which is the question, what is green? So then that we can take that and put that into financial products, put that into capacity building, our engagement with investors, our research, and that of others all around the world. So I'm going to, hand over to Marianne, who's going to take us through the criteria. Thanks, Marianne.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everyone. I am Marianne Rodriguez, the sustainability analyst, coordinating and leading the criteria development process for hydrogen. We started this process in 2022, focused on hydrogen production projects. But this year, we decided to expand the criteria to cover also hydrogen delivery projects. So as part of this entire process, we created a technical working group with professionals and experts from all over the world to provide advice on low carbon definitions for hydrogen projects. So we had the opportunity to work with a fantastic group of people that supported this process during almost like 2 years. Dr. Emre Kenzer, who will be part also of the discussion panel, was the technical lead also supporting the criteria development. We will also have Marta and Safar representing the rest of the technical working group. In addition to that technical working group, we also had an industry working group providing advice on the applicability of the criteria. This group essentially was created with representatives from the industry association from Brazil, Europe, also representatives from corporations and companies working on hydrogen projects. We also had some investors and verifiers, which are organizations in different parts of the world working close with Climate Bonds, using our criteria to assess and certify low carbon projects. Now, what I want to do is offering you an overview of the criteria. So what can be certified? Well, essentially, with this criteria that we are launching today, we will be able to certify bonds financing decarbonisation measures within facilities producing hydrogen, for example, retrofits, or also projects related to manufacturing of electrolyzers, membranes, but also we can certify bonds financing entire hydrogen production facilities or hydrogen delivery projects. Recently, we launched the last version of the climate bonds standard. And because of that, now we also can certify assets not linked to any specific financing instrument. That's the case, for example, of hydrogen production facilities or entities working on hydrogen projects. Here you can see the scope of the criteria. So as mentioned before, now we can certify different activities and projects, not only focus on production, but essentially in the entire value chain, conditioning activities, transportation and distribution, storage projects. But here you can see also in the white dotted line, the system boundaries for the greenhouse gas accounting. We are promoting a compatible production and delivery emissions benchmark, regardless of the specific production technology or the delivery pathway. We consider that accounting for upstream emissions and downstream emissions, for example, from transportation activities or storage, is essential to ensure that hydrogen projects really have a low carbon performance and that really contribute to mitigate climate change. So our criteria have two main components, the mitigation component and the adaptation component. So about the mitigation criteria, we cover or we can certify, as mentioned before, projects and decarbonization measures within production facilities, but also we can certify production facilities, delivery projects, and entities and sustainability-linked debt, which includes sustainability-linked bonds and sustainability-linked loans. So we develop criteria for specific projects classified in 4 different categories. One is feedstock substitution projects, for example, to shift from fossil gas-based production to biogas. So we can certify those kind, for example, the infrastructure for implementing those kind of technologies to replace or substitute the feedstock. Also about electrolytic production, and another category, which is various, that includes diverse activities and decarbonization measures. For example, a specific project that wants to finance the manufacture or acquisition of electrolyzers. Yes, we can certify it. Or the infrastructure for implementation of carbon capture and storage or utilization in an existing facility, producing hydrogen using fossil resources, but also the infrastructure for electrification of processes. The last category is about research and development projects. We also can certify those. But we also set criteria for entire facilities producing hydrogen. The overarching requirement is meeting an emissions intensity threshold of 3 kilograms of CO2 per kilograms of hydrogen at the time of certification. So if a facility wants to be certified, that's the main requirement. But in addition, for example, for facilities using fossil resources, those facilities need to commit or to have a transition plan to be close to net zero by 2050, following those benchmarks that you can see here in this table. And beyond the emissions benchmark, we also set specific requirements depending on the production process or depending on the feedstock. That's the case of electrolytic production, where we set the additionality principle, temporal and geographic correlation. For facilities using fossil gas, methane monitoring, reporting, and verification mechanisms are essential. And for projects using biogas, for example, the source of the biomass is part of the requirements. It must be from waste. That's like the main requirement for those kind of projects. And for hydrogen delivery projects, which includes compression, liquefaction, transmission and distribution network, or using liquid organic hydrogen carriers or ammonia or methanol to store and transport hydrogen. We also storage projects that includes the construction or operation of hydrogen storage facilities or the conversion of existing underground fossil gas storage facilities. We set requirements, but the main one, like the overarching one, is basically demonstrating that projects, delivery projects, are for low carbon hydrogen purposes. And a specific project can demonstrate that if hydrogen meets the emissions benchmark that I presented before, or also if that specific project have any other low carbon hydrogen certification, including guarantee of origin schemes or other like national certifications. Of course, hydrogen leaks detection, repair, and mitigation mechanisms is an important component of the criteria for delivery activities and safety considerations. As mentioned before, this is only an overview, but you can go to the details in the criteria document and background document that are already available in the website. And the last part of the mitigation component includes criteria for entities and sustainability-linked debt. The requirements include meeting the criteria for production facilities or delivery projects, also having a transition plan to reduce emissions to be close to net zero by 2050, and of course ensuring that their operations are, at the moment of certifications and in the future, dedicated to low carbon hydrogen production and delivery. And the second component of the criteria, which is about adaptation, is another important part because we are promoting that projects are not only low carbon, but also adapted and resilient to potential risk, climate change risks. So for that, we adopted the adaptation and resilience framework, which are principles developed by a group of experts some years ago, but we adopt those principles to each specific sector. And in essence, a specific project must complete a checklist where the issuers or the applicant to certification can demonstrate that they already identify clear boundaries, that they already had a risk assessment to identify potential climate change risk, that they have a mitigation plan, that they also had an assessment of resilience benefits of the specific project, and of course, ongoing monitoring and evaluation. That's essentially the adaptation and resilience component of the criteria. Well, I think that this is the overview of this. I think that now we can move to the most interesting part of the webinar, which is the discussion panel. Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Great. Well, we've got three very excellent panelists here, and I know, Marta, you have to leave us soon, or possibly leave us soon. You're in the heat of various different negotiations. But maybe I'll start with you, and then I'll do a quick round so you can introduce yourselves. But maybe I'll start with kind of just thinking about, once upon a time, hydrogen was just sitting there minding its own business on the periodic table. And then suddenly my mum asks me about hydrogen, which was very surprising to me. So kind of what's the deal with hydrogen? Why is my mum asking me about hydrogen? Why has this suddenly reached global attention? And maybe I'll start with you, Marta, and then I'll go around and we'll do a quick round of introductions.
So hello, everybody. Thanks you for having me here. And sorry for potentially having to leave early. I'm still at COP and the text is supposed to drop anytime soon. So my name is Marta Lovizola. I work for Bellona Europa, and I follow our work on energy systems and hydrogen in particular. And so, yes, my mom also knows what I work on now, which is very nice. So hydrogen has is a clean burning fuel. It means we can burn it without producing emissions, and so has the potential to intervene in very different parts of our industry and our energy system as a substitute for fossil fuels. This is one part of the story, and this is the part of the story why more and more people are learning about hydrogen as a potential climate technology. A climate technology, though, that has been portrayed more and more as a silver bullet. So now, we moved from something nobody knew about to something that potentially could decarbonize everything. Unfortunately, the story is a little bit more complicated, and hydrogen, yes, when we burn it, it's clean. It doesn't produce CO2. But the problem is what happens in the production of that hydrogen. So how do we get to hydrogen? Hydrogen is the most common element in nature. We found it in most, organic molecules, but at the same time, it's really hard to find just as hydrogen. And so we have to produce hydrogen by separating more complex molecules like methane, like water. And to be able to do this, we need energy. And to produce this energy, we can do this in a clean way. And so the entire process is clean. So if we use renewable electricity to split the water molecule, then this can be an overall clean process. And at the end of the day, we can burn this fuel and it's clean. But at the same time, if at other parts of the production chain, actually we emitted CO2 to produce that electricity that then goes into splitting the water, the overall impact of this hydrogen is definitely not clean. And actually today, hydrogen is mostly a climate problem rather than a climate solution. Hydrogen today is produced over 95% of the hydrogen that we have is produced from fossil fuels. The most common technique is what we call steam methane reforming, which actually splits the methane molecule into hydrogen and CO2. And actually, we produce 10 kilos of CO2 for every kilo of hydrogen that we produce. So yes, hydrogen has the potential to decarbonize many sectors, and especially heavy industry sector and those that we call hard to decarbonize or too lazy to decarbonize sectors. But at the same time, it needs to be produced in a sustainable way. If not, it doesn't deliver on what it promises.
Thank you. I like lazy to decarbonize. I'm gonna pick that up and add that to my repertoire of sayings. I know just in case you have to run, could you just give us a quick overview of the EU context? I mean, clearly the EU taxonomy process already went through a lot of this process, like we've gone through climate bonds and thinking about what is green when it comes to hydrogen. Can you give us the kind of quick notes on what happened with that and where you got to in the EU process? That would be useful, and then I'll turn to the others just in case you have to hop off.
So as I was just saying, producing hydrogen can produce emissions. And so to consider this hydrogen clean, low carbon, we need to make sure that in the production process, a very limited amount of emissions are produced. So the EU taxonomy put a threshold to define what qualifies as clean and what doesn't qualify as clean, and that was put as 3 kilograms of hydrogen, 3 kilograms of CO2, sorry, for every kilogram of hydrogen produced. That is more or less a 70% reduction on the fossil fuel route that we use today. Though that's not enough, because when you how do you calculate what goes in, what doesn't go in this 3 kilos? Where do you put the boundaries of your LCA analysis? And so the EU has gone further and has developed a specific methodology for green hydrogen, or the way renewable hydrogen, or the way we call it at the EU level, RFNBOs, renewable fuels of non-biological origin. And this has been a very heated debate in the EU, but basically after 2-3 years of negotiation, the EU landed on a definition of green hydrogen that sits on 3 pillars. The first pillar is additionality. So you need to produce this hydrogen with additional renewable electricity. This means that you cannot just source your electricity from something that was already on the grid and already decarbonizing our current electricity uses, but you need to deploy new additional capacity. And this is because hydrogen is a very electricity hungry process. And so if we just cannibalize the renewables that are out there to use them to produce hydrogen, then there won't be left to decarbonize our current electricity uses. The second pillar is what we call deliverability. Or geographic correlation. This means that there needs to be a physical connection between the electricity production and the hydrogen production. And in Europe, this sits into what we call the bidding zones, so the same electricity market. And this is to ensure that the electrons can actually travel. Because if, let's say, green electricity is produced in Spain but used in Germany, there is actually no real connection between the two. And this would mean that the electricity would be curtailed in Spain, and then in Germany, instead, you would switch on a gas-fired power plant to produce that hydrogen, and that is really not green. And then the third pillar is temporal matching. So renewable electricity, especially wind and sun, unfortunately do not produce all the time. They are producing in a non-dispatchable way, in an intermittent way. And so you need to use them when they are available. And so the EU settled on an hourly matching. This means that the electricity needs to be produced and used during the same hour. And this ensures that actually you're using the electricity when it's available, and hydrogen gives a service to the grid by ensuring that the electricity is used when it's available, and we're not bringing in fossil power plants, dispatchable power plants in moments of scarce electricity for the production of this.
Thank you. Wow, that's a hugely useful introduction to some of the thinking that went into the EU and the kind of complexity behind this question, kind of what is low carbon when it comes to hydrogen production. I'm going to turn to Emre to kind of introduce us and tell us, your elevator pitch on why hydrogen has hit the global headlines and why this is important and for all of us to kind of take note of.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you very much, Marianne. It's great to be here. So I think Marta gave a great overview. So like my story about hydrogen is like, I don't want to repeat Marta. So first of all, why do we need hydrogen? So we had been discussing about electrification, renewable electricity, so on and so forth for a long time as the silver bullet solution. But we come to a point that we see electrification has its limits. And what I really like to call this is basically we were focusing on electrons. Now we need something else. And hydrogen is a single molecule, so I call them protons. So now we also have this opportunity to complement electricity, clean electricity, with hydrogen, a molecule that can be stored easily, transported easily relative to electricity, and more importantly, converted to other kind of molecules, fuels, so on and so forth. So, but ultimately, the reason we are discussing hydrogen today is to decarbonize. And the decarbonization potential of hydrogen relies on how we produce hydrogen. And here, I think the main focus also for the criteria document that we have been working for the last 2 years, as Marianne stated, is how we can make sure that we are capturing this part, which is the decarbonization potential of hydrogen, while making sure that it is applicable. Because it is very easy to overcomplicate things. So if we come up with a way of saying that, okay, you need to produce hydrogen with zero emissions today, it is possible, but it is very expensive. And that is currently the showstopper. So I think the beauty about hydrogen is we know hydrogen. So we have been using in refineries, for fertilizer productions, for other chemicals, so on and so forth. There are pipelines, storage facilities, production facilities, everything is available technology-wise. There might be some technology breakthroughs that will be helpful to transition to a more hydrogen economy, hydrogen-heavy economy. But technology is not a bottleneck. The current bottleneck, it is very expensive because hydrogen has not been used as a commodity or as a simple energy carrier. So it was mostly a feedstock to chemical processes. Now, that's the part that we really need to tackle. And in this criteria document, we really wanted to make sure that we can enable these pieces. So, and I think, as Marta also mentioned, so ultimately, the goal is low carbon hydrogen. And we have a very nice scale of where should we start in terms of emission intensity and where should go in 2050. So today it is 3 kilograms and we'll be going all the way to 0. We have a like a nice trajectory, but the goal here is being technology agnostic. So can you get to 3 kilograms per CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen with fossil technologies? Hard, but you can. If a project can do that, they should qualify. Can you do it with renewables? Absolutely. Then we should really focus on these initially if they make economic sense, so on and so forth. So basically, like in a nutshell, I think the goal here is to make sure that these criteria are applicable and it will accelerate the transition to hydrogen-heavy energy system for decarbonization purposes.
Thank you. That's really useful, and kind of moving away a little bit from the colors and thinking about green, red, or pink, or I don't think there's a red, but and more towards thinking about low carbon in its own right. So that's a really important point, something that, as all of you were developing the criteria, was a kind of really important decision about that technology agnosticism. Zafar, I'm going to turn to you. I won't get you to kind of introduce us on hydrogen. I will get you introduce yourself. But maybe there's a few questions coming into the Q&A, and I might get you. It seems like our audience are more technical than we thought, so I'll open it up with a few other questions. But one of them was kind of really around the question of trade-offs, around, you know, between food security, clean energy, and whether there's, you know, creating green hydrogen from clean water is this a trade-off we have to be worried about. I mean, this is something that comes up a lot when we discuss environmental goals and criteria in particular, the question of trade-offs. Is that something the group considered a lot? And yeah, it'd be interesting to hear your views.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Zafar. Firstly, I work for Agora Industry in our hydrogen team. And my work mostly focuses on Africa. So maybe just to add a little bit to the elevator pitch first, from the supply side, which wasn't really focused on so much in my colleagues' amazing introductions. So I think for me, what's particularly interesting for hydrogen is that it provides quite a singular opportunity for renewable-rich countries in the global south to harness that renewable potential that they have and create high-value, resilient green economies, which is basically a core requirement for them to achieve their just energy transition goals and ambitions. And as my colleagues mentioned, there are certain uses for the molecule that are what we term no regret. So if you look forward to a carbon neutral 2050 economy based on renewable energy, there are still certain applications that are, instead of saying hard to or lazy to decarbonize, we can call hard to electrify. And for these applications where you can't use electrons, you need molecules. And so for these applications, so like steel, chemicals, fertilizer, long distance transportation, we can work towards embedding these high value value chains within these countries and creating these jobs, for example, green iron and green steel. And this is the kind of work that we're interested in and focusing on. And one aspect that I think is vital to really increase the speed of decarbonizing these carbon-intensive global value chains. So I think that's quite important. The next question you asked me was about water, right?
Sort of trade-offs and water. Yeah, clean water.
Yeah.
How do we How do
So
we deal with that
did
trade-off?
consider environmental aspects when we were developing the standard, and I thought that we did a good job without going too much into detail. Like we said, we wanted it to be globally applicable and not kind of too prescriptive or hard to comply with. And water is obviously an issue that gets discussed very frequently when it comes to renewable hydrogen. And it's a good question. What's important to understand is that if you oversize your desalination, you locate renewable hydrogen projects at the coast, oversize the desal, it adds a very minimal cost on top of the LCOH. So the hydrogen project in these areas can actually be kind of a springboard to address water scarcity rather than something that exacerbates it in particularly dry regions. It's of course important to realize that you will have high brine creation from these projects. So you will need to comply with environmental regulations in these countries. Now, we did reference the fact that you would need to also include those environmental approvals when you're applying for the standard. There might be a gap in areas that have weak environmental regulation. So that may be something we can look at in the future, but right now there is a do no harm to existing water bodies requirement in there. What that means in non-coastal areas is obviously quite a lot of work would need to go in there and to understand the stresses that you're putting on existing water bodies or fresh water sources. I guess if you look at it in a situation where you're replacing an existing coal mining operation, which would use a lot of water anyways, and you can prove that you're using less freshwater resource than that coal mine, then potentially you would get that environmental regulation approval then. And if you provide that with the standard, then that would suffice. But yeah, coastal projects can really help, actually.
Thank you very much. So we've had there's a few questions in the chat, and some of them are more around how do you take what the criteria say, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase a bit here, and the requirements it puts forward, and kind of standardize that and apply them, particularly in emerging markets. Zafar, you mentioned, this being a big opportunity for the global south, meeting just transition goals and that sort of things. But how is there, are there going to be challenges ahead in thinking about standardization of measurement and calculation, particularly for the global south? I don't know who feels that they would like to take on that one.
I mean, look, there will be nuance across geographies, and that's something that will have to be dealt with on a project-by-project basis. And I think, particularly if you think about one that I'm aware of, at least geographical correlation, one of the aspects that are enshrined in the EU requirements and something that we've put in as well, make very easy sense or clear sense in the European context, and the mechanism and the market is mature enough to be able to kind of track that and manage that. If you put it in a different situation where there are no bidding zones, it becomes less applicable. When you put it in a situation where, for example, the South African grid, which is very congested, and you're putting requirements that electrons can't flow across areas of congestion, then it becomes a question of how do you measure that? How do you comply with it? It becomes a little tricky at that point. And this is what Emre was saying earlier. We tried to make it quite high level, but at the same time stringent. So I think we've walked a good balance between those two with the standard. Of course, project by project basis, we'll have to see going forward what needs to be tweaked and what doesn't. But right now, I think it's an excellent starting point.
Thank you. Emre, I don't know if there's a few technical questions coming into the chat around kind of clarification on some aspects of the criteria. So one of them is kind of the renewable energy component. So if you could maybe give us a bit about that and whether that comes under a different part of the certification. So how does that tie in with other criteria? And then there's another question about, I think, which is to Marta's point about sort of one like for like. So, does is the standard hour produced to hour consumed match, or annual kilowatts consumed versus produced versus, so is it per annum, per hour? What are we talking? So there are a few more kind of technical questions that for our technical audience it might be worth touching on.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the like, I also briefly want to touch upon what the previous question about like regional differences.
Please.
So like we understand that there is a big difference where you deploy these projects, and we really wanted to make sure that in the criteria we are not like eliminating options. So it is quite flexible, quite open, with minimal restriction that complies with the decarbonization principle that we have. But coming back to these questions about renewables, so like we also make sure that the renewable, like the additionality principle has been incorporated in a way that it enables new development. So for renewable power, if the electricity is supplied from like curtailed electricity, so if there is any additional electricity that is available, then it can be used for hydrogen production and it can qualify under the criteria. But other than that, we are followers of additionality principle, so it should have a new renewable generation for the purpose of the hydrogen production. As far as I remember, we didn't introduce annual or hourly matching, so we only introduced the total generation. But basically, because that's also again very restrictive based on where you are. So there are some regions in the world that you can really follow hourly generation, because solar and wind have complementary resources and you can have very high capacity factors. But there are other regions that you have great renewable resources, but hourly matching might be challenging. And so like we really want to accelerate this hydrogen deployment, and that's our main goal of this criteria. Having said that, this is especially important for the transition, because right now we are starting from next to zero in terms of renewable hydrogen. And when we deploy renewable hydrogen projects and we hit a certain limit, this will become more important. So hourly matching, how we generate powers for hydrogen production, so on and so forth. And to also make sure that we are not doing something that can be detrimental for climate, we will be updating these documents frequently. So, and that will be basically, so let's say in 3-4 years, in an ideal world, we see a major deployment of renewable hydrogen projects and we hit 100 million tons per year. Then we need to revisit and say, okay, so after that point, we should definitely start hourly matching, something like that. But initially, like it is very flexible and it is mostly about the total emissions that you will be getting from a project and from the entire supply chain.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think, you know, starting from a point of view of trying to really grow this industry, you know, and then moving towards kind of tightening that over time is like a key part of a lot of the criteria development work we're doing. So another question that's come in is really trying to tackle, which is definitely something that comes up a lot in hydrogen discussions, the idea around use cases, which are kind of eligible and which are not. And Marta, you kind of touched on this a little bit. The specific question is around whether hydrogen has the potential to play a role in reducing the carbon footprint of oil and gas industries. So you're welcome to answer that, but if you want to maybe talk a little bit more about kind of the thinking around use cases and you know, and how the group tackled this issue, and then I'd love to hear the others' view as well.
So as we mentioned, producing hydrogen, it's quite complicated and requires a lot of electricity. Because we change energy vector, we actually lose electricity along, like we lose energy along the value chain. And so producing hydrogen or high quality hydrogen in particular will be very complicated. And so we need to start thinking about the use cases of hydrogen with this idea that hydrogen will be a scarce resource. And so we need to use it only in those sectors that are, you know, not electrifiable directly. So this reduces the uses of clean hydrogen to the places in which it is at feedstock. So we think about fertilizers, we think about new ways to produce steel, the chemical sector at large, sustainable aviation fuels, ammonia production also used as a shipping fuel. Now, specifically on the oil and gas sector, hydrogen is heavily used in refineries, and so using clean hydrogen instead of the dirty fossil fuel-based hydrogen in refineries will definitely help a little bit reducing the emissions from the oil and gas sector. At the same time, most of the emissions from the oil and gas sectors do not come from the hydrogen used in refineries. So yes, using clean hydrogen in refineries, for instance, to produce, plastic products that we will need beyond 2050 if part of fossil fuels are to be left in the system, can contribute to decarbonization to a certain extent. But let's not fool ourselves. Using clean hydrogen to refine oil, to produce gasoline, to burn in our cars is not going to solve the climate crisis.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a good point. It kind of putting things in perspective, and it's a sort of quantum of actual emission saving that can be achieved kind of minimal in that particular space. But maybe, Emre, thinking about some of the other use cases, how did the technical working group deal with this issue? Clearly some use cases we want to prioritize and others we don't, but it's difficult to do in criteria development. So how did you tackle that, and where did you come to land on that?
So this was probably the most controversial topic that we fought over during our technical working group discussions. Like, joke aside, so I think this is important to prioritize like industries or applications for use of hydrogen, because initially it will be extremely valuable to get low carbon hydrogen. But I think picking winners or eliminating some options really does not help the situation right now, because ultimately this is an economic decision. So like switching to hydrogen is expensive, and some of the applications have higher margins. So if you think about like heavy industry, where you have very limited options, like carbon capture or use of hydrogen, for example, for steel industry, and clean hydrogen can be almost like a cost competitive alternative to switching to like a cleaner resources. So for that sector, hydrogen makes a lot of sense, even starting from today. When you think about like long haul trekking, where you need energy density and the charging time makes an important issue, or the payload reduction because of carrying a large batteries is difficult, then hydrogen makes a lot of sense. And these are some of the lower hanging fruits for like hydrogen applications. But again, so it doesn't really make any good for hydrogen industry to pick winners and then go after these. And to the question about oil and gas industry, so I agree with everything Marta said about like, okay, so for oil and gas industry, for gasoline or diesel, of course, the close to 80-90% of the emissions are coming from the combustion of the fuel. However, you can really clean or minimize the emissions from refining by using clean hydrogen. And again, so here clean hydrogen is not necessarily green hydrogen, because right now most of the refineries are co-producing hydrogen from some of the gas that is produced within the refinery boundaries. And by including carbon capture to these kind of hydrogen production, you can kind of decouple carbon capture from energy or refinery operations, and then reduce overall emissions quite a bit. So again, so this is not necessarily a completely carbon neutral solution, but you can make a significant reduction in refinery operation. And re-emphasizing, it is a small portion of the total emissions from burning gasoline, but still a part of it.
Thank you. Yeah, so plenty of thorny topics covered over the course of the work. We're kind of moving towards closing remarks now, I think, as we wrap things up. So maybe I'll start with you, Zafar. There's a question in the chat which I think is beyond the scope of the technical working group, which is really, how will environmental regulations get standardized, which I think is probably beyond the scope of the work. But you mentioned something interesting when we spoke before, which was using the criteria work to develop a common language, around what we think about and how we approach this. So maybe you'd kind of like to offer a few thoughts on that, knowing that we might not be able to directly influence, environmental regulations and standardization. But what was the thinking on the technical working group in trying to kind of assist with developing this common language around criteria development for hydrogen?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's, a common point across all criteria development as well. It allows us to, like you mentioned, provide a common language to ensure that when we're talking about sustainable hydrogen, we're actually referring to a molecule that has the same emission profile, and that its LCAs, both in the production and the transportation, which we measure both in the standard, is measured in the same way. I think that's really important, and this is an amazing first step that we're doing to get there. In terms of environmental regulation, I think that's a bit more difficult to standardize and probably a bit more regional specific as well, definitely outside of the scope of what we're doing, but also equally important, I feel, and something that definitely needs to be considered. I think when it comes to ramping up the hydrogen economy, like we were talking about before, this is the phase that we're in right now. Yes, we want to standardize, but we don't want to over-regulate. Also, when we're thinking about end uses, like, for example, the oil and gas example that we just had right now, in this ramp-up phase, there's a very high green premium that needs to be paid. And someone has to pay that in the next coming years. And in my opinion, if the oil and gas industry is willing to pay that, for everyone else to benefit downstream from that, that's okay. Also, being cognizant of the fact that in every transition scenario, there's a little bit of oil in there, even in a 2050 scenario. As long as we keep it low and prioritize no regret applications, I think we'll be fine. But I think, so the work that we're doing right now with the standard and the CBI certification to mobilize sustainable finance is incredibly important and super vital to realizing hydrogen's potential. So yeah, I'm really happy that we've done this and we've taken that first step. And I'd be very interested to hear what our participants that sat on this call and reviewed the standard think as well afterwards. I know we've done a comprehensive stakeholder engagement, and that was also quite interesting to see their comments, but I'm sure more comments will come through, and I'm excited to learn as well in the next step.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued to hear everybody's comments. Marta, any kind of closing words from you on, I know you're kind of got one ear on what's happening at COP, but this work is just coming out today, the criteria, but obviously the work that you began with the EU process has been out now for a while, and that's been kind of implemented. So kind of, any parting words of wisdom from the lessons learned over the past 2 years of looking at the EU taxonomy criteria? Sorry to put you on the spot, asking for wisdom.
So, no, I think what is important here is that it is very tempting to lower the criteria, to water down the criteria, and to accept only half clean hydrogen as part of the solution. But the reality is that the atmosphere is not going to give us a discount. Every single ton of CO2 that we put up there contributes to getting us closer to 1.5 to 3 degrees. And so I think that if hydrogen is to contribute to global decarbonization, then we need to define it in a way that that does do this. And the industry often complains about these 3 criteria because it makes it harder. Well, if it wasn't hard, we would already have solved the climate change. But solving this is hard. We're not setting ourselves up to success if we water down the criteria. And actually, even with the very stringent criteria at the EU, we are starting to see projects develop. We're starting to see this hydrogen economy, picking up. And we do not want to fall in the trap that happened, for instance, 10 years ago with biofuels, in which, we needed an easy solution. And so we regulated biofuels poorly, and we ended up cutting down the entire Amazon forest to produce biofuels, and we created new problems. So I think, history has taught us that we need strict criteria. We need to define things in a way that actually allow them to contribute to decarbonization. And I think we are much better equipped today, both in the EU, but also on the standard that we're starting to see elsewhere in the world. For instance, the 45V methodology that's coming up after the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, that very much mirrors at least the leak we saw so far, very much mirrors the one of the EU. So it's very tempting to water this criteria down and think that one day the grid will decarbonize and everything will be perfect. The reality is this doesn't come with discounts. It is hard because it is hard, and we just need to do it properly from the start.
Thank you. And Emre, over to you. I mean, I think Marta's laid out the challenge. Let's not water it down. As the lead of our technical working group, where's this going from here? What how do we take this forward, get take up, and where do the criteria go? You mentioned they don't sit still. So, what next?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think also starting from the regulation point. So I think this there's a big challenge, but also it comes with a great opportunity, because if we make it right, it will be very beneficial for all of us. And I think spending some time, and even for example, for this criteria development, we spent 2 years. It could have been done in, 3 months or 6 months, and it could have been somewhat okay, but we spent quite a lot of time just to make sure that it is right, and we are not missing any big pieces that will be important for mitigating climate change. And I think this gives an opportunity for policymakers, regulators to make it right. And Marta gave a great example from 45V in the US. So basically, everywhere around the world, now we are seeing more and more regulations supporting the clean hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen playing a bigger role in the energy transition. But for coming back to this criteria document, exactly what you said, Bridget. So this is not a document that is done. So we cannot claim that this is the ultimate criteria document that we will be providing. So the goal here is to monitor what's happening in industry. So how things are changing, both in the regulatory aspects as well as with applications in different industries, and see how we can make it stricter or looser to enable use of green bonds in right places. And that's, again, the goal here. And in terms of the frequency of updates, that also depends. So we are very flexible. So if we see a major deployment in the next couple of years, then we need to revisit as soon as possible. And I think it will be great to bring this group together. So I'm really looking forward to working again together. But if things are going slower, or we don't see any problem, then we can continue as is. So basically, this is the approach we are taking. And I hope that it will really help revitalizing hydrogen economy. And maybe this time we will really see a hydrogen economy and hydrogen playing a role. But I'm really excited the launch of this criteria document, and looking forward to what is next. And also, as Zafar mentioned, so I'm also very curious to hear the real feedback now that it is it's live.
Excellent. Well, we're extremely excited. It's hydrogen might not be a silver bullet, but we know that it's hugely important to all the lazy to abate and hard to electrify are two new terminologies that I learned today sectors, and so hugely important to all the work that we're doing across all industries. So it really does cross-cut a lot of the work that we've been doing in steel and cement and a whole lot of other industries. So thank you very much today. Really, really useful discussion. Thank you to Marianne for leading the work and for taking us through the criteria today. To Marta, live from COP. To Emre for leading our technical working group, and to Zafar for taking us through some of the details of the work and giving your reflections. So thank you so much, everybody. Very useful discussion. And we look forward to all the remaining work to come.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Bridget.
everybody. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.